I'm Michael. Welcome to Beyond the Screenplay. Today we are talking about Groundhog Day, and I'm joined by the Lessons from the Screenplay team, writer Trisha Orand.
Salutations.
Writer Brian Bittner.
Hello, hello.
Editor Alex Calleros.
Hi.
Trisha, you were the one that brought up Groundhog Day and suggested we do it. Why did you want to talk about Groundhog Day?
Well, in fairness, I was not the first person to bring up Groundhog Day. You've been getting requests for Groundhog Day, and it is one of the most discussed and analyzed screenplays ever.
Of all time.
Yeah.
There's a specific person on Twitter that for 3 years now has sent me a tweet on Groundhog Day being like, Groundhog Day video today? And last year I was like, you need to tell me before the day. I can't just make the video happen. But he was excited this year to see that we did it.
I mean, it's such a delight. And it is a movie that people come back to over and over and over again, not just because it's a holiday every year, so you are going to remember that it's happening and that the movie happened, but it's just so joyful, the experience of watching it. Actually, last year, I and some friends watched it on Groundhog Day, which was the first time we'd ever done that. Like, let's just download it and watch it on Groundhog Day. And it's just so good. It encapsulates so many insane things about like the holiday and like just American holidays, which is totally bonkers.
It's a pretty strange holiday.
Oh my God. Yeah.
It's the most just kind of like, how did this even begin?
Yeah.
What's like the weird, like pilgrim origin story of this? Like,
Yeah,
It also
exactly.
surprised me on the YouTube comments how many people were like, why is so many people posting about Groundhog Day today? And it's like, because it's Groundhog Day. And I realized like, oh, I guess in the other parts of the world, like they don't know that's a real holiday. Like,
Right.
Totally.
Because it really shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Holiday with
Right.
a lowercase h. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Right. You don't get work off. Yeah.
A few years ago, I was teaching adult students English. So I was teaching mostly Chinese adults to speak English. And so sort of half of what I was teaching was English, half of it was American culture. And so we would do every holiday in the most classic, like, kid status third grade version of the holiday. So we like carved a pumpkin on Halloween and everything. And so on Groundhog Day, we like watched the movie Groundhog Day, and I was trying to explain it, and I was like, I don't know. We have this animal, and also trying to explain what the hell a groundhog is. Anyway.
Right. It's something you can't really explain. Well, so, and then also from, a storytelling perspective, besides just being a joyful, amazing movie with a ridiculous holiday.
Just talk about how weird the holiday is for an hour.
Besides watching it on Groundhog Day.
Right.
Yeah, I feel like, Trisha, you really wanted to talk about premise. I feel like that was the thing that really resonated with you.
Well, I really can't think of a better example of a movie that better fully exploits this fascinating premise. Because I feel like I see a lot of films that they have like one really interesting idea and then they don't push it or explore it. And yeah, they just like lose some of the opportunities that they could have had by like forcing their characters to go through something that this idea would imply or would naturally lead to. And Groundhog Day is truly like, it's one simple, revolutionary idea, and it's just pushed all the way to its outer limits in such a way that is perfectly tailored to what the character has to go through in that movie. In terms of like talking about exploiting a premise, which was what I wanted the title of that video to be, and then actually the word exploiting the premise never even made it into the video. But like in terms of exploiting a premise, there really is no better example. And so that was one thing I felt would be super useful to sort of get into.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think the thing, I think sort of, I feel like in the video we convey what, exploiting a premise can mean and what you were saying of how other films don't do it. I think what clicked for me when we were talking is that, like you said, it is such a simple idea, and it shows that a film can just be a simple idea, but if you mine that idea for everything, it has everything you need for a story. So rather than letting go at some point and letting Phil Connor's like, oh, well, he kind of broke the cycle, which I feel like Edge of Tomorrow kind of does. Like, I feel like that's the one disappointing part of Edge of Tomorrow, for me anyway, since we're talking about repeating day movies, is that the third act feels like it kind of like cheats, like it changes a little bit and it's like it's not quite the same rule set. And I feel like Groundhog Day really sticks to its rules and allows the character to just go all the way in that world.
Totally. The one thing that you really want from an idea like that is for everything else to feel true to life. So it's like the movie, it has this impossible premise. It can never happen. Obviously, that could never happen to anyone ever. But that's the only crazy thing that happens.
Right.
And so it helps to keep the movie focused on like what are the implications of this one thing, and it doesn't muddy it with all of this other like, and then this other crazy thing and this other magical or whatever like thing happens. And so yeah, I just feel like it's the power of one really good idea and then staying focused on that one really good idea instead of trying to introduce a bunch of new ideas or like a bunch of new rules where
or complicating it
Exactly.
unnecessarily.
Yeah, and a lot of people have said this. It's never explained why.
Right. There
Yeah, you
could
don't
been
have
a
the
whole-
gods looking down on him saying like,
Yeah.
well, oh, if he changes, then we'll let him go.
like
You know, that kind
a
of-
Wonderful Life kind of a
Right.
angel premise. Yeah. And I feel like, yeah, there could have been a version of it where they worried about, oh, we have to explain this ultimately. And then it would have been a weird subplot of like, you know, explaining the mystery behind his paradoxic, you know, time travel thing
Mhm.
happening, which would totally be beside the point of the movie.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was a draft, wasn't there, where they explained it?
I don't know, Trisha, you were at the video. Tell us.
Yeah, because
I feel like you said that.
I've always heard that there was a version of it that was kind of less profound. That was less of this like almost spiritual kind of transformative story, and was more just kind of goofy or weird. And they kind of made a choice at some point to push it this direction. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I mean, well, you don't want to focus on the mechanism. So actually, from what I've read, Danny Rubin came up with this idea and he didn't want to explain it. He purposefully wanted it to be like, you never know why. It doesn't matter why. Because truthfully, it doesn't matter why.
Right. And I think even in one of the special features, he talks about how in his first draft before Harold Ramis came on, it like started in the middle where it was already in the midst of, you know, Bill Murray like reliving this day. And he was very much like, I don't want to lose that. Like, I don't want to just be a normal movie that has a normal introduction. And then one of the producers was like, well, why don't we just try it and see what happens? And then it, you know, it worked out pretty well.
Right.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, my understanding is that Danny Rubin wanted it to be this totally unexplained phenomenon. Harold Ramis came on board. They ended up doing, you know, going to like a studio and the studio did want an explanation. It would have been a while ago, but I think I did read a draft or I mean, Danny Rubin has done 1,000 interviews and articles about Groundhog Day. Like which is awesome that, you know, one of the most analyzed, discussed screenplays of all time is actually highly accessible in how it was written, how it came about. He wrote a book that we quote in the video called How to Write Groundhog Day.
Very specific lesson.
Yeah.
Incredibly useful. So there's that part. But I do think there was a point at which they were like, yeah, it was a curse from an ex-girlfriend. And then the minute someone said that, they were like, never mind. Like, we've tried it.
Right. Because I like it when films can just like embrace their what if question. Like, it's a movie,
Right.
it's a story. This is a story about what if this happened, go. And I think, yeah, as soon as you have an explanation like that, it just begs more questions of like, well, what happened with that ex-girlfriend? How is she able to do that? And that
Right.
completely,
Yeah.
Is she a witch? Yeah.
right, like removes the focus from, you know, the story. And I feel like, you know, fairy tales are based on, you know, random things that don't, you know, there's magic all the time. Like, magic's fine if you, I think like you were saying, Trisha, like just have the one magic element and then it's about watching real human characters reacting to that situation. Yeah, Groundhog Day is good.
Well, I mean, one of
Thanks
the
for
things.
listening. We'll see you next time.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's there's not much controversy around this movie because it is so universally loved.
Yeah.
I don't know how you can not love this movie. You have to be a really, I don't know, a bad person because I really feel like I've heard people say before that it's a Buddhist movie. It's actually it kind of almost rooted in Buddhist philosophy in some ways because it's about, you know, Phil Connors starts off in the most, you know, egocentric, identified with his small self, his just annoyed ego where everything is wrong all the time. And it's basically him, having to live a bunch of different lifetimes and it become enlightened basically by the end. And he tries to try everything as you go through in the video, Michael, he tries everything to not be enlightened until ultimately it's like, actually, the only thing that really makes me lastingly happy is just being of service to others and seeing them be happy. And for that reason, I think it's a movie that you can't help but be really moved by, because it's super profound in this really kind of funny Bill Murray package. So it's really special that way. I don't know of many movies that do both of those things. It's such clever writing, but also so deeply profound.
Mm-hmm. And I think that part of the reason for that is a lack of explanation as to like why he's stuck in this loop, and it almost elevates it to like a fable, right?
Yes,
exactly.
Yes.
Or some kind of like, it's almost like a Pilgrim's Progress, kind of journey that's just straight allegory.
Right.
And
yes. Yeah.
It's a really beautiful article, but it was an interview with Danny Rubin, who we can talk about. And the article was saying that about the spiritual aspects of the interpretation, and talking about how Phil is only released when he learns to bless this day. This sort of like spiritual idea of blessing the day that he's living instead of resenting the day that he is living. Or feeling like it is in some way plaguing him. And actually, Andie Macdowell's character, Rita, says that in the movie. She says, like, maybe it isn't a curse. It's all on how you look at it, kind of thing. Maybe it is a blessing. And when Phil is able to sort of arrive at that place is when he is released, which again is incredibly spiritual.
Yeah.
Right.
There's also like, if I could take like a weird philosophical detour here, Nietzsche has this concept, eternal recurrence, which I learned about in college in one of my philosophy courses. And he says, like, imagine a demon slink to you in your loneliness and said that this life you would have to live over and over again. All the choices that you make, you would have to basically watch yourself make over and over. So it's not like Groundhog Day where he chooses what he's doing, but it's basically saying like, how would you live your life differently if everything you did, you would have to watch yourself do over and over again, And I know it's really heavy. And if I could get a little more heavy for a second,
please.
There's the movie Lost Highway by David Lynch. Anyone see it?
It's on my list.
A lot of people didn't see it.
It's on my list.
And I'm going to spoil the ending because it's a David Lynch movie, and having the ending spoiled does not mean you're going to understand the movie at all.
Yeah.
Right.
At the beginning, Bill Pullman, he wakes up, he hears the door buzzer, and he hits like the intercom, and someone says, Dick Laurent is dead. And then throughout the course of the movie, he makes certain choices, and he's not the best person in the world, and blah, blah, blah. And at the end, he's driving away from the police, and he gets out of the car, and he runs up to the intercom, and he says, Dick Laurent is dead. And then he drives away. So it's like a weird, like, one-off Groundhog Day where you're like, well, what happens next? Does he just do this forever? But the thing that it really reminded me of, and I'm going to get a little more dark and deep for a second, is this short story by Neil Gaiman called Other People, where a man walks into a room, and he knows right away it's hell, and that the person standing at the other end of the room is a demon. The thing standing at the other end of the room is a demon.
Whoa.
And the demon starts torturing him, and then he has to relive his entire life. They have to go through every single moment of his life, and he has to admit all these things that he did wrong, and then he has to do it all again. And then when he does it again, he's like, it was even worse the second time because I knew what I'm talking about was wrong. Like he was for it, and he had to do it again and again and again until he's completely destroyed. Thousands of years go by. And then he wakes up when he's finally like opened his heart and he's finally like made a change. And then he wakes up and the demon's gone. But then he sees this man walk into the room and he realizes, oh, I'm the demon now. And he has to then.
What? Neil Gaiman,
so that's where my head went thinking about Groundhog Day.
That reminds me of, there's a book called Some. I don't know if you guys have read it, but it's kind of like a series of short stories almost. But it's kind of like different visions of what the afterlife could be. And one of them is called Some. And it's basically like, what if in the afterlife you had to experience everything you've ever done, but like it's grouped by categories. So like you spend 10 years brushing your teeth. Or like you spend like 45 minutes like crying about that one episode of TV show, or like whatever it is. It's
the one
like,
where Will Smith's dad comes back and then
exactly. Right. And so it's what you were talking about reminded me of that, of an interesting version of it. It's interesting that we, with stories like Groundhog Day and all these other, kind of fables, like you said, Trisha, that we're connected to, that there's just the interesting visions of the spirituality of how to different ways of experiencing life that we imagine, and watching people deal with that is always a really fascinating story premise.
Yeah. Well, it's Dickensian. It's very like a Christmas Carol-y kind of thing. which also Bill Murray. You can watch him in Scrooge.
I know. People in the
around
YouTube comments were
same
like, "Oh, this is the modern Christmas Carol." I'm like, Bill Murray was in a modern version of a Christmas Carol. Right?
time. He actually did do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
No,
it does feel like a holiday movie for that reason. Not because Groundhog Day is a holiday, but more like a Christmas holiday movie because of that Scrooge transformative aspect.
yeah.
Mhm.
And I feel like that's one of the things I'm so impressed with rewatching the movie is just Bill Murray's performance. Because
Oh my
I
God.
feel like he almost physically changes, as the movie progresses and just the way his energy is on screen. And then I was thinking about it, I'm like, oh, but they had to film all of these scenes, all the
Yeah.
Groundhog Day festival scenes were all the same probably shoot day.
Right.
Right.
But you see him through this entire journey in that setting. So he has to be kind of keeping track of all these different stages of his development. Like, what the heck? And
Right.
it works. Like
Yeah.
It's super impressive.
I'm never not tracking his evolution.
Right.
Every interaction with Ned Ryerson on the sidewalk
Yeah.
was shot back to back to back.
Right.
to back. Yeah.
And I was thinking, what an interesting thing for an actor too is that Bill Murray is playing this. He's playing the same scene over and over again with the knowledge of the previous scenes, whereas Stephen Tobolowsky is. He
Right.
in his world, he's seeing Phil for the first time in 10 years every single time. And it's
Mhm.
not like it's a dramatic performance or anything like that, but it's like it's got to be a weird thing as an actor to do, to both be playing like different versions of something.
Stephen Tobolowsky is amazing in this movie. Like,
Also, for as much as I never thought like a sort of slapstick moment would be my favorite part of the movie, the punch
Oh
is
my
amazing.
God.
He does the full 360 turn to the camera.
Yeah.
Sounds so funny.
It's so good.
is it Ned Ryerson, the character,
Uh-huh.
is just like so well rendered and realized by Stephen Tobolowsky. And what a delight. Like, just,
It feels like a classic movie performance,
Yeah.
almost like a timeless.
oh my gosh. And he's just a supporting character. And in the original draft of the video, I wanted to talk about how it's important to keep Phil around the supporting characters because they serve as markers to help us track Phil's journey.
Mhm.
And Ned Ryerson especially does that.
Yeah.
Right.
Where it's like he goes from like being incredibly rude to him and wanting to get away from him to punching him in the face. And then by the end of the movie, they're both affirming, like, this is the best day of my life.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's so beautiful, but it's Ned Ryerson and some of these other, like, even what's the name of the waitress in the diner? But even her, like, she goes on this journey with us, and like we are following that scene in the diner where he's taking Rita around and he's saying,
Yeah.
like, this is this
Introducing
person, this is
everyone.
this person, and
Mhm.
Michael Shannon is there.
Right.
Michael Shannon.
Michael Shannon.
baby Michael Shannon.
Yeah.
It's that beautiful scene where these characters feel known to Phil, even though they don't know Phil, but Phil knows them.
Right.
And so we are put in that space with Phil of it's so endearing. Like
Mhm.
we start to love Punxsutawney the more that Phil loves it, the more that Phil is like, yeah, falling for this town full of people.
Yeah.
Right, we really are with him through the whole journey because
Yeah.
I'm with him at the beginning. I'm like, this is kind of an annoying festival. Like,
Right.
The Pennsylvania polka.
I don't identify with this music or
They're
these
Hicks,
people.
Rita.
Yeah, exactly. And by the end, I am like genuinely charmed by everything. So
Well, it kind of reminds me of No Country for Old Men and how the
I know,
Really?
those two movies, everyone.
Yep.
The DVD double pack at Walmart is
Yeah.
always.
reminds me of No Country for Old Men, comma, in that the supporting characters, even though they don't have much screen time, they feel so fully rendered and
Yeah.
they feel three-dimensional, and you just like get them immediately. And they
Sorry, Doris.
Doris, yes, that's the
That's the waitress in
waitress's
the
name.
diner.
Trisha
Doris.
Breathe.
Yeah. Very excited. But yeah, like even like the drunks at the bar, like they're only in a few scenes, but you feel like you really understand them and like they've kind of changed by the end. Like I think this movie's just good at everything. But I think
Right.
particularly I'm struck by how using these supporting characters can help, like you were saying, Alex, make us care and like invest in the world. And like you were saying, Trisha, as markers to show his journey and just make the world feel more lived in and believable and just enhances everything.
it just feels there's a lot of love put into all the characters.
Mm.
None of
Yeah.
them are throwaway, one-dimensional BS characters. Like they all feel like fully loved characters by the
Right.
creators who want to make them something special.
Yeah,
And then
absolutely.
ultimately loved by Phil.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
You know, there are a ton of estimates about how long Phil spends in Punks, how many
Oh, I love that
thousands
stuff.
of
Yeah.
years
Yeah.
that Phil
love
spends
that.
in Punxsutawney. But, you know, ultimately, it doesn't matter exactly how long. It's long enough to know every inch of sidewalk and every person. Like when he does go around that diner and he's just like, I've gotten to know this person. I spent a day with this person probably, or several, or whatever. And that's one of the smartest things about the writing, because it's so contained. And when Danny Rubin set out to write a movie about immortality, one of the smartest things he ever could have done was make it contained.
Right.
Yeah.
He's not going to go visit Egypt or, do all these crazy adventures. It's like, no, he's going to just get to know this very tiny place.
Well, in the book, he was talking about that. Like he wanted to do a story about someone that lived an eternity to see if they would change. But eternity means like, well, so is he like visiting the French Revolution and like what's is that the pyramids, like
Right.
etc. And so that's the spark of the idea was it's eternity, but it's just the same day over and over again. So
Yeah,
it can be
in one
contained.
place.
Yeah.
Right.
He can't get out.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's not a big place. I think that's what makes it interesting too, is that they limit the premise where even if he says, I'm going to go have the most hedonistic, like do whatever I want kind of day, and I'm just going to do that.
Not too much to do.
And I'm just going to do that every day forever. He's going to get bored of that too, and
Yeah.
it's like you basically put him in a place where it might take 10,000 years, but he's going to eventually have nothing to do but become a good
Right.
person.
Yeah. Well, and Tricia, I think that's one of the things you mentioned when you were talking about originally pitching the idea is that it's a contained place that's like specifically designed to be like the worst place for Phil
Right.
and also
Right.
then the best place for Phil to undergo his character change.
Yes, exactly that. And it feels like you don't want to give your character too much space. And that's exactly what we've all been talking about. But if Phil had the potential, because he arrives at this point where it's like, I'm all powerful, I'm a god. And in some ways he is, because he knows exactly what's going to happen and he knows everything about everybody, but only in this tiny square block or whatever.
Mhm.
And that is what again makes the story so compelling, is that we all understand that about Phil, like our tiny lives that we get to know these people in our tiny lives and over and over and over again do much of the same things every day. Isn't the VR game, there's a VR game that's coming out.
Apparently, I've avoided the trailer because I don't like the idea of anyone making any kind of sequel to Groundhog Day.
Yeah.
Wait, so it's a sequel?
It's
Yeah.
a sequel
It's like
VR
Phil's son.
game about where you play as Phil's son.
I mean, I'm kind of intrigued by that. I mean, why not? It's a VR game. It's not going to, they're not making a movie sequel. Yeah. That sounds cool.
Yeah, it could be interesting if it becomes then about putting you in the shoes of Phil, or in
Right.
this case, Phil's son, who I think his name in the game is Phil Connors Jr., which
my
just the eye rolls around this table are just intense. But you are playing as Phil Connors Jr. and you're trying to escape essentially. But the thing that's so brilliant about Groundhog Day is because we don't know what will ever free Phil, and Phil doesn't know what will ever free Phil. It becomes this open-ended game in a way where it's like, seems like nothing will ever get me out of this. And I'm just going to try random stuff until something changes,
Mhm.
basically.
That is a cool premise for a game. That is cool.
Yeah.
I'm warming to it.
I don't know if that's actually what the game is. That's my idea for the game.
Well, I was thinking about what we were saying earlier about we don't really know how much time has passed. And I think that's another brilliant aspect of the screenwriting is like, it's so epic, actually. Like, it's such visually and theoretically, it's a very small premise, very contained and very quaint. But it's implied very clearly in the dialogue and what he knows about the town and how he can predict every little thing happening that he's been doing this for like thousands of years, maybe.
Yeah.
Which is like super epic and almost like a sci-fi mind-blowing idea. So it's just I'm continually amazed by how this movie is so it has such a small package. It looks very quaint and simple, but it's actually buried inside of it is like kind of mind-blowing stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, there's so much you can talk about. Like my girlfriend brought up the very dark question of, if he, tries something with Rita and gets slapped in the face, does he then go jump off a bridge? Or does he use the rest of his evening?
Oh, right. Yeah.
So and I was like, I would hope he would just be efficient. He'd go practice piano or then go to sleep and then wake up the next day and try again. But it's you can think about all this stuff. Also, there's the other, the weird idea of he doesn't know that any day might not be he might do something awful, which it's a PG-13 movie. You don't get you don't really see him do anything too bad, but he might do something really terrible. And then the next day, February 3rd, got to deal with it. And I was talking about it, and then we were just oh yeah, we could write a really dark version of this where he either survives if he lives his best day or his worst day. And then he wakes up on February 3rd, and then guess what? Then it's well, if you wake up on February 3rd and you've done all those terrible things, you probably just go kill yourself. And then you wake up again on February 3rd.
Oh my God.
Just we started going down a really dark rabbit hole. We're that's not what Groundhog Day is.
This is the Blumhouse sequel.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think there was a draft of they were obviously exploring different ideas as they were developing it, Danny Rubin and Harold Ramis. And there was a draft where Rita was also trapped in her own time loop.
Oh, interesting.
And it was, I know.
That changes everything.
I know.
That's crazy.
That's what Russian Doll is.
Yeah.
So it's, sorry, I'll let you finish.
No, go.
But it's Natasha Lyonne keeps dying and she has to keep reliving, but then she meets someone, and this is in the trailer, so it's, not too much of a spoiler, but she meets someone who's also going through it, and they start figuring out. So every time they both die, they still have their each own consciousness. So then they start working through it together.
She has a buddy at least.
Yeah. So it's cool because right up until the last episode of the show, you're I'm not sure what is every time you're kind of okay, I think I get what's going to happen now. You're no, that's not quite it. So it's super watchable, by the way. It's people are oh, there's this plot hole and whatever. It's whatever. It's a really fun way to spend 4 hours. Anyway, Trisha, you were saying.
Oh, no, I actually would love to go a little bit down that rabbit hole on what Groundhog Day has changed and influenced.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which is virtually everything in some ways. It's so the 80s and the 90s were the era of the high concept movie, where it was just one incredible premise. This is new filmmaker era. This is Spielberg and Lucas and all that stuff. And it's the kind of Stranger Things is leaning into that tradition of this, high concept movie. And Groundhog Day did an amazing job of helping studios reimagine what that might be. The movie it really reminds me of is Big, actually.
Interesting, yeah.
Which is this really simple premise, but is explored every avenue of it, and it's that one simple idea. It's what if you woke up and it's all body switch movies or something like that.
Liar, Liar, or Freaky Friday. Yeah.
Vice versa, Like Father, Like Son, The Change Up. There's so many body switching movies. Big is a one direction body switching movie, but there's a bunch of movies, like you said, in the 80s that were all roughly the same premise. Vice versa and Like Father, Like Son, I think are the exact same premise, and they came out within a couple years of each other. And it's why did they make another one?
I think the VR game is called Like Father, Like Son.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, God.
Sure.
Totally.
The Groundhog's Day sequel VR game.
VR game. It's called Groundhog Day, Like Father, Like Son. Michael throws down his headphones and just leaves. Never mind.
Like Father, Like Son with Dudley Moore and Kirk Cameron, everyone's favorite father-son duo from the 80s. No one has seen that movie except me. I had the VHS and watched it a bunch.
Not the person to ask.
I try to avoid Dudley Moore movies if at all possible.
No, when I said no one, I didn't mean no one at the table. I meant no one has seen that movie but me. Yeah.
So I hear Dudley and I just think of Harry Potter.
Dudders.
Yeah.
I literally pictured that actor from Harry Potter.
Right.
Yeah.
I forget you guys are young.
Well, it's cool that Groundhog Day has become a verb, essentially, or a descriptor of what a movie is or can be. So it's it's Groundhog Day, but, or actually I was reading about how in the military, they use Groundhog Day for a tour of duty almost, or the term Groundhog Day from this movie onward is used to describe a day on base in Afghanistan or something. I should look it up more, but that idea of there's this sense of relatability, but also what are we experiencing day to day at a micro level that Groundhog Day has become synonymous with. And that's a testament to the way that this movie touched people and impacted people. And it's cool that has seeped into not just pop culture and that kind of thing, but like movies of the same genre that have been inspired. So we've talked about Source Code and things like that, but also Edge of Tomorrow, which I think is one of the best examples.
Right. Well, it feels like there was almost like a waiting period in movies where it's like, well, it can't just like remake Groundhog Day, but now it's like the floodgates are opened, and I feel like Edge of Tomorrow was the first one that was like, no, we're going to do the same thing, the same premise, but we're going to recontextualize it as an action movie. And I feel like a lot of things about that movie work really well, and others don't as much in some ways.
And Source Code was a few years before Edge of Tomorrow, but Source Code was a little different. Source Code was almost like a video game because it's like he's in this other consciousness, where Edge of Tomorrow is more, and Russian Doll are more like, no, this person is reliving the same thing over and over again. I guess actually Russian Doll, it's weird because it starts going like, oh, things in the world are a little different. Like that plant was more wilted than it was yesterday. So there's a little bit more going on. Edge of Tomorrow, I would say, is probably the purest Groundhog Day kind of. Because
one of the things I like about Groundhog Day is that it's like
Groundhog Day, Michael.
Thank you.
I know. I always do that too. I think it's Groundhog's Day for some reason. Like,
it's really not.
Like the Groundhog owns
it. It's not his day. It's our day where we take him out of his cage and look at him.
We own this day.
I don't know how I feel about that. But one of the things I like about Groundhog Day is that it's kind of like a time travel movie, and it follows the model of time travel that I like a lot, which is just like whatever happened, and there's everything's going to be exactly the same until you change it, and then that's going to have a ripple effect.
Right.
So it's interesting that Russian Doll is different, but that's also what I liked about Edge of Tomorrow is that it follows that same model.
That was one of my problems with Source Code, was that it didn't seem to have clear rules, or like the twist at the end like barely made sense, or I think it was one of those things where if you're going to do this premise, there's part of the expectation I guess I have as a viewer is that it's going to be done 100% and done with clear rules, and like you stick with those rules, and like any twist that come out of that makes sense. And I think that's Groundhog's Day is like the simple, clean
Groundhog Day.
Groundhog
Thank
Day.
You,
oh my God.
See, that's my problem too.
High five.
Groundhog Day has the simple, clean version of that premise, and some of these other kind of iterations of it, I think you can get into trouble when it's like we're gonna explain it, or it's gonna be twists on it. It's gonna get more and more complicated, and then it's like, well, I don't know, this is fun anymore, or is this just getting too convoluted? And why are we trying so hard? The premise itself already works.
Edge of Tomorrow has a nice twist on it, which is a very simple twist, which is that Emily Blunt had that ability in the past.
Yeah.
So it's like she lived through this and made it out, and then now she realizes Tom Cruise is doing it too, and that's simple. There's not too much going on with that, and
and the mechanism is kind of simple too. It's just like alien stuff, like aliens cause it.
Alien magic.
That's all you need to know.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things that was interesting about Edge of Tomorrow, where through the second act it is the same day over and over again, and it is following that, but then the third act is like, oh, like we've broken it now, or like and it was interesting because suddenly it's like, oh, there's stakes, like now people can die, but there's like a lack of fun. Like watching it, once that happened, I was like, oh, now it like matters, but also it's like, oh, well, now it's just kind of a normal movie. And I think that is one of the nice things about Groundhog Day is like, once it's over, like it's over, like he's broken it, you're done, happy ending.
But I do feel like for the genre though, like Edge of Tomorrow as an action movie, you do want a point in the action movie where like people can die, and I feel like Groundhog Day, you don't need that, but I understand why they did it for Edge of Tomorrow, and I liked that change. Yeah.
You don't want it to be pure video game,
right? Where you
you could just make a video game,
right? Where you just respawn like a VR game, perhaps.
Exactly. For example.
Total side note on Edge of Tomorrow, I just loved seeing Tom Cruise as a guy who didn't have his like stuff together.
Yeah.
It was so satisfying.
Is it Brendan Gleeson at the beginning who's like the general? He's like, oh, we think you're going to go into the field, and he's like, I don't think I'd be a very good candidate for that. He's like, no, you're going to. He's like, well, I don't know about, and then you realize like, no, you don't have a choice, and it's like just cool to see Tom Cruise be like, I'm not comfortable with this,
and then Emily Blunt just being so badass and amazing.
She's awesome.
I think that's where I like fell in love with her, was that movie.
Doing her crazy like spin moves that he has to like try to get through like the field to get to. He just keeps dying when he gets through.
I was just like, yes, Emily Blunt, yes.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I was originally going to talk about in the video was the Hidden Tools of Comedy by Steve Kaplan, which we've mentioned before, has not actually made it into a video yet, although someday probably.
True. I'm sure it will.
it's fascinating because, he spends a chapter talking about the comedic premise, but then most of what the book is about the comedic hero, and originally we were going to talk about in the video, which is that somebody with a lack of awareness, or rather no skills. Somebody who doesn't have the skills to deal with something insane that's happening, but keeps trying anyway. And that is the heart of Groundhog Day.
Mm-hmm.
It's very easily sum upable in that like time capsule of what an idea is. You have Phil, who absolutely, because nobody would, an ordinary person who doesn't have any skills whatsoever to grapple with suddenly becoming immortal, but never gives up trying. And I think that the middle of Groundhog Day does a really good job of showing that grappling with these incredible stakes, or just this incredible problem that you cannot beat. It's insurmountable odds, and you cannot beat that. And yet somebody who does it, and even when Phil gives up, he cannot beat it. Like, he gets turned into this really dark place where he just wants to get out of it, end his life, like get out of it in any way that he can. And yet he's not even allowed that way out. The problem is so enormous that he can't get out of it. He never stops struggling. He never stops struggling to not just escape it, but deal with it, live with it, whatever. And I think it's such a good word for comedy, but also for like all of our protagonists, is that your protagonists can't be allowed to give up.
So it's like the ultimate make it worse, like it's always make it worse to your protagonist. And I mean, he kind of makes it worse for himself in a way, because he's internally being driven crazy by this repetitive day. But like you say in the video, it's relentless. The premise is relentless, and it never gives him any kind of reprieve or a break. There's no like mid-movie break where like temporarily he gets to live a few days and then it goes back to Groundhog's Day. Just always Groundhog Day. And so I think it's a good example of like not going easy on your character. That's one thing I've had to learn as a writer is just, don't go easy on your character. Put them in the worst place possible. They can still have fun while they're in the worst place possible, but don't make life easy for them. That's boring. And Groundhog Day never makes it easy for him, which is great.
Yeah. I kind of categorize it. I put it into the category that I keep like Inside Out in, where it's like the story is also the structure. Like it's all like on the surface level. And I think what's interesting about Groundhog Day is, like you were saying, Alex, that the relentless nature of it, where it's like the protagonist needs to change, but it can't just be like on this day, like, well, they gave up and now they're going to change. It's like, it's such a great example of Phil Connors only changes because he has to. Like he is forced to. There's no other option but to change. And I think great stories should be that. It's not just like the protagonist like doesn't want to, and then like they change their mind one day, or like then the premise changes, and like, oh, today they like met somebody new, and okay, I guess I should change then. It's like the story design should force the protagonist to change. And I think Groundhog Day is such a great example of that.
And the harder the protagonist struggles, the more rewarding that change is for the audience to witness.
Yes, because I think some of the movies that aren't satisfying are kind of paint by numbers films I see once in a while, where it's like, it's just, it's a big Hollywood movie, and it's like, well, here's the part where they need to change. And you feel like we just arrive at that page count or that beat in the movie, and it's like, oh, because it's, end of the second act, beginning of the third act, it's time for them to have the revelation. And so then they just do it. But I don't know why they're doing it. I don't know why they're changing. There's nothing in the story making them definitely have to do this now. It's just time for it to happen. And I think that's one of my biggest problems with, structure is so important. But if in that structure you're not earning those major transformative beats, then it does feel very hollow and empty. It's why is this happening right now? I know it has to happen in an archetypal story, but there's no reason for it to be happening.
A recent movie I had that with was not the protagonist, but Bad Moms Christmas of all movies. Which,
of course, Brian.
I will say, I think Bad Moms is an awesome movie. I love it to death, and I thought the sequel was great too. But Christine Baranski plays Mila Kunis's mom in it, and she's just terrible, like completely like awful person, like just hates the daughter and da-da-da. But she's like kind of sweet to like the grandkids and that kind of thing. So it's a little bit of like, oh, is it just through Mila Kunis's eyes that she's terrible? But you as the audience like, no, she's pretty terrible. And then like at the end of the movie, she's like, you know, I've always loved you. And then like they hug and it's like, wait, what? Like it sort of felt like you didn't see that character go from like having a change. You just saw her suddenly in a scene go, I'm going to tell you something that for some reason in the past 30 some years I've never told you, but like I actually love you and I'm just hard on you because I want to whatever. And it's like, okay, like it was just weird. Like still a good movie. Check out the Bad Moms movies, guys.
Whereas in Groundhog Day, like I completely buy that he is 1,000% a different person by the end,
right?
Which is crazy,
right?
You know, that's really hard to do in 90 minutes, 2 hours. That's,
Well, and I think it's partially because they take it to the darkest place. Like he kills himself many times.
It's like almost like overdoing the like death rebirth like archetypal story. It's like he dies and rebirths like a lot of times.
Many times. Yeah.
I think that the easy version of this, which is sort of what you guys are talking about, is having a mentor character that's like, you need to change.
Right.
You're never going to learn anything until you change. Or what that version of a character, which like, obviously we need that character in some archetypal stories. But I think one thing that feels so profound about Groundhog's Day.
Ooh.
Groundhog Day, Trisha.
Brian 1, Trisha 0, Alex 0,
possessive.
0. High five myself.
One thing that feels so profound about this film is that there is it's just Phil. Phil is left entirely to his own resources. He's left entirely to his own wit, understanding, all of that. And so no one tells him that he needs to change. He absolutely like flogs himself until he like comes to that arrival of that transformation that feels so organic. And it is entirely self-dependent. One other movie that I think is similar is Run Lola Run, actually.
Oh, right. Another Groundhog Day
three
movie.
loops, right?
Yeah, it's 3 loops, but she is so solitary in the way that Phil is, which is like no one can understand this, but this one character.
Right.
No one can come to this place. No one can figure their way out of it. Not in an escape, but in like a just the personal truth that needs to be reached. And Run Lola Run is one of my favorite movies of all time. And it feels really beautiful. And it feels like you go on that journey with the character. And it feels more earned in a way than if you had like Gandalf, no offense to Gandalf, telling
give
you what you have to change. Yeah, exactly.
Phil is not the character going, reliving Groundhog Day. That happened to me back in '06. Let me tell you about it.
Maybe in the VR game, we'll have a wise mentor who's lived through it.
Probably.
Could it be Phil Connors Sr.?
Perhaps.
I want to shout out real quick a comment on YouTube. I know we don't normally do this, but Chris Napper had a theory that Ned Ryerson is an angel / demon. So the only reason any of this is happening to Phil is because he was a jerk to Ned
on that first day.
Yeah, on that first day. So like whatever Phil's going through has nothing to do with any of this. It's only when he like actually is nice to Ned that Ned's like, okay, this is the best day of my life, best day of your life. Now we can move on. If he
was just nice to Ned on day 2, it would have been over.
Bing.
Bing.
Exactly.
Also, Stephen Tobolowsky as Sammy Jenkins in Memento. Like there's 2 movies where he's sort of like almost the totem someone who's Memento is not someone reliving the same thing, but it feels like it because of the direction he's going, you know.
Also, while we're here, can we talk about Andie Macdowell for a second in this movie?
She's so charming. I love her.
Oh my God.
100% love. It just goes without saying that she's amazing. And I feel like she's such a great foil to Phil. And she's like, because I like that she's not just like completely disgusted by Phil. Like she has so much empathy that even though Phil is a jerk, she still like feels sorry for him as
sort
opposed
of has an open
to,
heart.
Yeah.
She's still trying.
Yeah. And I feel like she's just so far on that side that has empathy even for a terrible person.
But what I like about her too, though, is that she's not this one-dimensional, just like lady who exists to help the guy. Like she clearly does have her limits and does have her issues with Phil and makes them clear at different points in the movie, whether through slaps or through just the way she reacts to him in the diner sometimes when he's stuffing his face. She is disgusted by him, and she has is it a Shakespearean quote to say to him about himself?
Yeah.
But at the same time, she's also such a beautifully empathetic person. It's all so well realized. And I believe that this is a character, this is a real person.
Mm-hmm.
Totally.
So yeah, I love seeing, especially older movies where sometimes the love interest, the female, supporting character is kind of just there as a thing for the guy to want to get.
Right.
That she really seems her own person, and a really beautiful person that is not just a typical, I'm just a girl here to be hot.
Exactly.
Yeah, and she can't be won over easily. As you say in the video, Michael, she sees through to the heart of Phil. And it's not until Phil actually changes himself in real life, in his own heart, that she is able to see that.
Right.
And that's a critical part of the screenplay design, that he, of course, would be successful at manipulating her to a point.
Mm-hmm.
And so that whole sequence in the movie, which is a decent chunk of the second act, where he is trying to manipulate her, be on the surface the person that she wants or might fall for. He does ask her, he's like, what's your ideal guy? And she tells him, and he tries to become that thing, but only
on the surface.
Yeah, exactly. The fact that he fails so consistently, and of course he has to fail a number of times, but he fails so consistently at actually manipulating her. You have to have that as part of the movie. You have to have that as part of the transformation. And I like that when we were working on the video, we were talking about his desire is to be with Rita. Because when we first meet her in the movie, she's such a nerd. She's standing there and
dancing around.
Yeah,
the blue screen.
In front of the blue screen. How, just so beautifully innocent almost. And just the enjoyment of working for a TV station in Pennsylvania. She's so optimistic and warm and really does value everybody. And even when Phil is incredibly rude to her in that first 15, 20 minutes of the movie, consistently, she just is so yes. She just says yes to everybody.
I feel yes about her.
Yes.
Yeah. I feel generally yes.
Well, and I think what makes her feel three-dimensional is that she is optimistic and feels kind of innocent, but also isn't naive.
Right.
When she's dealing with Phil, it feels like she's dealt with people like Phil before. She's not just
she takes care of herself still.
Right.
She's not just being used by everybody.
Yeah.
It's also, speaking of casting, that's the line that Bill Murray can walk is,
totally
is that even when he's being a jerk that's, I don't want to say charming. That's almost too nice, but
he's funny. So
but he
it
doesn't,
makes it okay. Kinda,
right. He's not mean in a way where you're God, I feel my feelings are hurt. He's mean in a way where you're oh, he's just being a smart ass,
Right.
Yeah.
I was thinking about just once again, the profundity of this movie. Another kind of life lesson in it is the idea of trying to go after a goal by superficially, presenting a version of yourself that you think, is the way to get that goal. And how, and this just in real life too, it's actual, just deeper self-transformation and not really even trying to get that goal anymore usually gets you that goal.
Yeah.
It just comes to you as opposed to you putting this fake effort into getting it in a cheap shortcut way. And that's just, as a writer, I can say that I feel like I've rushed through drafts or rushed through the process of writing because it's I want to get to the goal faster. And I'll just try to make it look like I know what I'm doing as hard as possible.
Right.
But there's deeper underlying problems that will take a deeper, longer process to fix. And the thing won't come to you unless you do that. So I just think, it applies to all parts of life. And it's another thing in this freaking Bill Murray comedy.
Right.
How is there so much wisdom in this
everything.
movie? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's kind of when I look back at myself in film school, film school Michael, I feel was very much, I think that's what's kind of appealing about being a director versus being a writer is I think it's fun to watch your favorite movies and see oh, that's such a cool shot. I want to do a shot like that. And even if you get really good at pulling off that shot, it's easy to forget that like that shot is amazing, not just because of the technical things that went into it, but because of what it signifies in the story. Like it has meaning.
It matters right
writing.
now because of what came before it.
Yeah. And I feel like that's a self-awareness that is critical if you want to actually do things that aren't just technically impressive, but emotionally powerful.
You have to earn certain things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just one thing, but like I want to make sure that I say something about this, but just that we talked a little bit about like comedy and the lack of awareness. I think one thing that enables us to relate to Phil, like you were saying, where he's like charming almost. So in that book, that The Hidden Tools of Comedy, they were talking about like appropriate responses and like just like appropriate behavior, and Phil's behavior is incredibly inappropriate at all times. But the fact that a person like Rita, when faced with overwhelming rudeness, actually doesn't behave appropriately in response either is what makes this movie funny. Like when Phil says something super rude, which any one of us would in real life immediately understand as rude and probably just walk away or be like, say something very rude in response, and it would quickly devolve into an argument. The people around Phil don't react that way, which enables us, the audience, to chuckle. Like if we would not laugh at Phil at all or like with Phil in those moments if people like actually allowed their feelings to get hurt.
It's kind of like a product of the time and place and
Yeah.
the people he's around. They're all such good-natured people that are,
I was going to say that, yeah.
they're overly giving benefit of the doubt at all times.
Right.
And so, yeah, it allows for a lot more comedy because, you know, the bed and breakfast owner is assuming the best, even though he's saying these weird things to her. And
I love her.
Yeah. I think, the comedy comes from that.
And that's also where the premise comes from, changing the character, because you surround this character with just good-natured people for eternity. You know, it's like eventually they're going to rub off on him a little.
Right. He might actually become a citizen of Punxsutawney in a metaphorical sense.
And literal at the end.
Yeah.
Let's live here.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
See, I feel like that's at the very end is when, like, as the credits roll, I kind of step back and do like a harsh reality mode check on that. And like,
are you going to ruin Groundhog Day right now?
No, I'm imagining me in that scenario. I've lived in this place forever.
Yep.
And it's now maybe like the only place I know. Like, would you want to live here, or would you want to escape, or are you like terrified to leave because what is the rest of the, like?
Right. There's like deeper, like that's where it gets almost sci-fi.
Right.
Like what happened to his brain for the last like maybe
like,
stepping out of Punxsutawney, he'd have like a panic attack now.
Right.
Like
I feel like I would come out of that on February 3rd and be like, no. I'm going to stay in here. I'm going to lock myself in the room. Because like if you lived an eternity knowing everything and then suddenly you know nothing, I feel like that can't be good for
That's an interesting idea of like a twist at the end of a Groundhog Day type movie. It's like they get freed and they're like really effed up about it. They're like, this is not okay. I am only used to being in the same day forever and I'm gonna kill myself now.
Right. I feel like that's the non-fable version of it.
Yeah.
Which is why it's nice that it's a fable.
Well, and just bringing it back to what we were talking about earlier, Danny Rubin's idea of like, what if someone had an eternity? They obviously would change over an eternity. But the beautiful thing about movies is they are 98 minutes or whatever they are. And we get to experience that self-examination, that like, what would I be? Who would I be if I were Phil? And how might I emerge from this 2-hour experience having learned something about myself, right? And that's why we're all here. Like that's the transformative nature of movies. And so like, you know, it might have been 10,000 years for Phil, but fortunately Phil is fictional. And this is like a story that we can all like discuss as theoretical and then come away with something that helps us see ourselves a little bit better in like a mirror kind of way.
Yeah, the real world Phil Connors just has a 1,000-yard stare for the rest of the time.
Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah, Groundhog Day is good. Okay, cool. Well, really quick, why don't we go around and talk about the creative lessons that we're going to take away from Groundhog Day. Alex, would you like to begin?
Sure. So I think something I realized during this discussion was I kept bringing up sci-fi. And I'm a big sci-fi guy. That's the genre I'm attracted to. It's the genre I want to write and direct in. And I think this movie shows me that you can have a very small, lower budget
Yeah.
like not even openly sci-fi premise and still explore the philosophical themes I normally associate with sci-fi in a different package.
Yeah.
And like Groundhog Day is no less profound than, you know, Ex Machina or like more heady sci-fi philosophical movies that I'm really attracted to and want to make things like. So it's a good kind of reminder. You can put these very deep ideas into really simple stories, and they can be maybe even more powerful because they kind of trick the audience into getting them, because it's a comedy. It's a sweet Bill Murray movie, but you're learning these very profound things about existence. So that's my lesson, I think, is you can do big things in small packages.
I like
Yeah.
it. Trisha?
It's a lot of stuff that we've been talking about since we started getting into this, but I'm going to internalize the lesson of, if you have a really big idea, apply it to a very small area. If you have a really big idea, apply it to one person, one town, and make it really accessible. And I think that like, I feel like it would have been really easy for somebody like Danny Rubin and Harold Ramis to get lost in the weeds of like, okay, so he's living forever. He actually is a god. Now he stops World War II or what, something huge, some huge application of this incredibly big idea. But they kept it grounded in such a way that it makes us all able to see ourselves in it. And I think that that's a really important lesson, especially for a high concept movie. Yeah.
Absolutely. Brian?
A lot of what I was going to say was pretty much covered in during the podcast, but I just kept thinking about the idea of forcing a protagonist into a premise. And I was thinking about Shaun of the Dead and The Devil Wears Prada. Like, both those protagonists could have easily just decided not to go out into
piece right out of that
into this world. Exactly. So having someone just trapped in a situation they can't get out of is a lot more interesting. And the fact that it's so limiting, like he's in this little town where there's only so much to do, even for, thousands of years.
Yep.
I was playing around with an idea of a short film that sort of takes place in like a sort of like a magical-ish scenario where a character is like trapped in somewhere. And I was playing with the idea of like, he really wants this thing to not happen, but I was like, oh, but what if it's forced, if that makes sense,
right.
Because there's the difference of, you need your protagonist to really want something, and that's why the audience cares, versus the protagonist literally cannot move forward unless this thing changes, period. And that's not to say you should always do that over the other. There's value in both, and but it's just sort of, it's interesting to play with those concepts.
Yeah, absolutely.
Michael?
Yeah, I think my lesson is kind of off of what you were saying, Brian, and something we've talked about before, is just I think my takeaway is that I'm always looking for examples of, the kind of phrases that you encounter in screenwriting books, like you must force your protagonist to change. And it's like, okay, that's a great sentence. I know what all those words mean. But like, what does it really mean? What does it look like when that happens? And so I love it when I kind of realize that there are movies that are examples, like super clear examples of what that looks like. And I think Groundhog Day will forever now be my example of like, what does it really look like to force your protagonist to change? Like, they have no choice but to change. And I think that's just a super valuable lesson. With the added note of Phil doesn't know that that's how he gets out of it.
Right.
So there is value in the fact that he changes because he chooses to, not because he finds, because the old mentor says, well, you got to do this.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Cool. Well, so what's everyone watching this week? Brian?
I have a couple little things I want to shout out real quickly before a bigger one. There's a short film by Stephen Frears with Robert Downey Jr. called The Route V50. It was actually like a Volvo commercial. It's like one of those like things where they get like a real filmmaker to make like a thing. But it's very Groundhog Day in the sense that like he's looking for something and then he runs into a different Robert Downey Jr. who's like clearly like has like knows what's going on. And then throughout the course of the movie, he keeps running into different Robert Downey Jr.'s until a certain point he starts becoming that version of Robert Downey Jr. and then he's interacting with the older version of himself.
I need to watch this.
So it's just
Did this
a fun.
come out a few years ago? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
A little
I remember
while ago.
this. Yeah.
Yeah. It's. I just thought it would be worth mentioning now. But in terms of what I've actually watched recently, because I haven't seen that one in a little bit. Green Book, I just thought was lovely. I think it's up for a bunch of awards and stuff, but I feel like not a lot of people are actually watching it and talking about it and stuff like that. And there's also like a little controversy surrounding it, whatever. But in terms of the movie itself, I just thought it was like a really well-made film, a really interesting story, and it's sort of an interesting example of a movie where the broad strokes are pretty predictable, but the individual moments are just really great. Like you don't know what to expect from moment to moment. And then there's a theater in LA that is doing 12 months of Kurosawa, and I am grossly undereducated in my Kurosawa for being like a film person.
Nice.
Same.
Me too.
So we went, and a lot of them are midnight screenings. I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm not going to a midnight screening of Seven Samurai. It's 3.5 hours long.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I can't do that anymore.
Yeah, but they did a matinee of Rashomon, which I had never seen, and it's one of his big ones. And I thought, it was timely because it's not Groundhog Day, but in the same way that when there is a movie that's like Groundhog Day, people say, oh, it's like Groundhog Day. Rashomon is the movie that sort of invented the style of different narratives that when one person tells a story, it's their version of the story, but then someone else tells it and you're like, oh, now I don't know quite what happened. Like it's literally called Rashomon style. And it's just a really amazing, well shot, interesting film that it's just amazing to see what people were doing in 1950 that still in 2019 it's like, wow, I'm impressed,
Yeah. Awesome. Trisha?
So I actually want to shout out a podcast that I've been listening to. I've been listening to Harry Potter and the Sacred Text, if you guys are familiar. It's like two sort of divinity students, people. One of them is definitely like a pastor now or like a theologian. The hosts are Vanessa Zoltan and Casper ter Kuile. And
those aren't real names.
They sound like Harry Potter names.
Truly. They read one chapter of the book per week and discuss it through the lens of a specific theme. So like loneliness or commitment are the first two. It's been on, you can listen, it's been going for several years now, and I'm just sort of like getting into it and catching up. It's really beautiful because Harry Potter, of course, is this like enormous archetypal epic story, and the way that they approach it as though it is a sacred text where they like sort of meditate on it. They meditate on the loneliness of the characters. They like do spiritual practices as they read it. And they view it as a gift. Like they go into it reading like, what is the gift in this text for us? Has just transformed the way that I look at a lot of things. And it's, what is the gift like in Groundhog Day? What is the gift in all of these other things? Like I've been thinking about just dwelling on because of the way that they read these texts that I really love. I love the Harry Potter books, but also what if we treated everything as that way? It's really lovely. And then the other movie I rewatched that I really like is Novitiate, which was written and directed by Maggie Betts. And if you haven't, it's sort of in the same vein.
Say the name again.
Novitiate. Yeah, it's about like a young nun that's like essentially pledging or like going through the process of becoming a nun. It's a fascinating and beautiful movie. It came out in 2017, and it's by this filmmaker that it's her first movie, really, and it's directed in such a way that like I don't think I've seen something like this, and I wonder if the director has ever seen a movie in some ways, but in a beautiful fascinating way. It's really well paced, and it's really focused also on like the main character, who is this young nun. So if you haven't seen Novitiate, go back and check it out, and then listen to Harry Potter and the Sacred Text because it's gorgeous.
Awesome. Cool. Alex?
So I've been hearing a lot about this documentary Fire, F-Y-R-E, on Netflix. I finally watched it last night.
Oh, yeah? How was it?
It is a delicious train wreck. It is, I mean, it's almost, so if you don't know what the premise is, it's basically this guy, Billy something, he was this kind of millennial mogul doing these kind of scammy millennial credit card, exclusive VIP, like rich white New Yorker millennial kid products. And like the ultimate expression of that was like, we're going to do the biggest, like most exclusive, most VIP like concert with like Ja Rule as like my co-creator in like this island that used to be owned by Pablo Escobar.
I remember when it happened.
Like,
it was crazy.
Yeah.
So basically it's just watching their process of that being such a cluster beep, and it's just you actually feel dread watching it, because as it gets closer to the date when all these people are going to be like flying on jets to this island and everything's falling apart, you're like, this, like the only way this can end is in the most embarrassing huge disaster possible, and then it Yeah.
It does.
It does.
They also used Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross's score work from like the Fincher
Social
films
Network,
and stuff.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's like everyone's just like, I love that they just took those musical cues to
I
be
feel
like,
like
yep, there's a lot of dread here.
I feel like I've heard Social Network music in a lot of things.
everything,
Did they make it public domain or something? Because it's been on NPR. I hear
A
it
lot
in-
of the music they released as Creative Commons license.
That's cool.
So
Okay,
you can
okay.
use them. Yeah,
Yeah.
like I've heard it on like Invisibilia and stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Anyway, it's well used in this, and it's really well shot, really well edited. You know, I've edited a lot of documentaries, and so I can tell when they've been well edited. This one's really well edited. I loved it. So definitely worth a watch if you want to feel a little bit of dread and a little bit of gleeful
Yes.
like
Schadenfreude.
yes.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Awesome. Maybe I'll do that tonight.
Michael.
I have been really busy this week, but so I've been slowly continuing to make my way through The Office still in my epic rewatch of The Office.
Right.
It's still really, really good. And I think Trisha, you were bringing up, the comedic hero as someone that like tries to do good and has no skills. And I feel like Michael Scott is just such a perfect example of that, where it's just because as I've been watching it, I'm like, why do we like him? Like he's such a terrible person in so many ways, but he's trying so hard to do good that you just can't help but love him, and mix in some Steve Carell, and it's great. So that's my continuing update on my Office.
Michael is still watching The Office.
Yes.
Yeah. Meanwhile, I watched all of The Office between December and January. I also am not running a YouTube channel. So,
I was going to say, you
more
have too
time.
much
Show
time on
off.
your hands, Brian.
Cool. Well, thank you everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation about Groundhog Day, and we will see you in the next episode. Hey guys, Michael here. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. Make sure to subscribe to Beyond the Screenplay wherever you get your podcasts. And feel free to hit us up on Twitter to share any feedback you have, what you want more of, what you want less of, etc. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next episode.